So this is a workshop on the functions of consciousness, which again, I think is a nice focus topic, but there's gonna be a rich set of issues that we're gonna get into today. As Dave mentioned, even the title's already kind of philosophically loaded, the functions of consciousness, so lots of issues to discuss today. It should be fun. Certainly this is a topic with a lot of practical implications, moral implications, social implications. So as Dave mentioned already, so some of this work, understanding the functions of consciousness, can help us understand different disorders in humans, so disorders of consciousness, understanding people who happen to be in vegetative state or in comas, so we have criteria for understanding what's happening in individuals like this. Learning the functions of consciousness is also very important for ascribing consciousness to other animals, so a lot of policy decisions have to do with or are based on our ability to show that animals have functions that we typically associate with consciousness. And also for AI research. So now I feel like half the people are either scared of or very interested in getting conscious robots. So understanding what the functional role that consciousness plays in a system is going to be very helpful for us for all those things. And it's also especially exciting to be talking about this 30 years after Ned published his first paper, or the seminal paper on this topic in 1995, where he really laid a lot of the conceptual foundation for our thinking about the functions of consciousness. He gave us our distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness, which I'm sure will come up today, very hard to avoid. But I think his paper also introduced a kind of pluralism that I think has been underappreciated in consciousness research, and that I'm going to be a dogged, relentless advocate for today. So my talk is titled "The Functional Contributions of Consciousness," and yes, I've been trying to get that new acronym published in a couple places, but I'm trying to get that picked up into the literature. The FCC
sounds like the functional correlates of consciousness.
Well, we'll talk all about that. Markers, theories, and the pluralist approach. Lots I want to talk about. Yeah, so here's the plan in particular. So the first thing I want to do is I want to start by trying to, as concisely as possible, describe the logic behind our claims about the functions of consciousness. So here's going to be a little bit of stage setting. I'm going to introduce some relevant constructs, some methodological principles, try to achieve just a little bit of systematicity before we get going today. I think that's a good idea on the first talk. This conference will be built this theme around, so get some preliminaries on the table. Then I'm going to briefly survey some existing hypotheses about the functions of consciousness. Get some of those on the table. This is where I imagine Matthias' brow is going to start to furrow. His talk gives a lot of excellent methodological challenges to some of the empirical work that these claims are based on. But we're going to survey some of the existing claims. Then I want to articulate and defend what's come to be known as the marker methodology in this area. And eventually, so this is a primary way of getting at the functions of consciousness, but it's come under scrutiny lately. And its major objection is that people think that we can't do anything with it if we don't have a general theory of consciousness. So I want to end by convincing you as much as possible to move away from the search for a general theory of consciousness and to shift kind of methodologically what we're doing in consciousness research. And maybe even that there is no such thing as a general theory of consciousness. So you can see my claims are going to keep increasing controversiality as I go on. And I'm hoping to save some of the most controversial ones for the end and we can kind of discuss them together. So, all right, so why don't you provide a little bit of background and then we get into this is the older version of it might be an older version. Okay, so to begin, so how do we situate claims about the functions of consciousness? What's their underlying logic? How do we situate them within the broad umbrella of the natural sciences? Well, there are a few foundational principles at play that should be brought to the surface. First thing to say is that consciousness research, it's kind of a consciousness 101 thing to say. Vast majority of what's been happening over the last 30 years rests on a fairly simple comparative methodology. Modern science of consciousness really began with claims about the neurocorrelates of consciousness. So here you go. Let's contrast what's happening in brains that are conscious versus brains that are unconscious, holding as much else equal as possible, which is going to be a big question that Matthias brings up. How do we actually hold all else equal? And the idea is to try to subtract out our conscious from unconscious neural activity. And this should give us minimally sufficient conditions for a neurobiological system that produces or causes or realizes consciousness or particular conscious context. So this is not new, this has been happening for the last few decades, really kind of blew up in the 90s. Should give us neurobiological or structural indicators. And at this point, we're going to say correlates of consciousness. We're going to keep that metaphysically neutral. Now, one of the most obvious objections, so yes, this is an old PowerPoint, so we're gonna have to just kind of talk through these points. So one of the most obvious objections that comes up first is, what do we mean by consciousness? So every time we start talking about this, first question everyone asks, what do we mean by this construct? How can we start comparing things that we have no idea what it means? We have no theory of it, we have no definition of this. How can we start comparing something like that? Well, note that despite this persistent worry, the target of inquiry in contemporary consciousness research, I think, is relatively uncontroversial. I think we're all interested in that feature of the world that terms like experience, awareness, sentience have helped us triangulate. We've got terms like intrinsic reality, things for the system itself, subjectivity, what its likeness. These all become cliches at this point. And they really help us pick out and identify the target of inquiry that can then be the subject of further scientific inquiry. So we have this construct that's emerged both through introspection and through reasoning about the behavior of other systems. It has become deeply rooted in our folk and our formal ontologies, and yet we don't have a clear definition or a clear general theory of what this construct is. But that's okay. This happens across the sciences. In fact, it's quite common for the sciences to start with these sort of abstractly described targets of inquiry based on maybe clearly identifiable cases, maybe clearly observable cases, and then to bootstrap explanations from there. And sometimes we never really reach a fully formed, fixed definition of our construct, right? So in other words, the two processes are very different, namely picking out or describing the construct and then explaining that construct in terms of its underlying structural and functional properties. So for example, in the history of science, we have this construct star. It would have come from simple observations of the sky, and over time, we try to understand its structural and perhaps functional properties. But those two, picking out the construct and explaining it based on those underlying properties, are related but very distinct. And this happens all the time in cognitive science as well. We get this trajectory from loose, but explanatorily useful and helpful constructs to increasingly precise cognitive science constructs, or constructs that we use in cognitive sciences. So topics like belief. So we had Plato carving up the mind into 3 parts. And now, based on those simple observations of we thought the mind was like, we have these developed many infinite theories of perception, fleshed out the construct as much as we possibly can. Sorry, I don't have my slides with me that I wanted it, so I'm a little bit.
You could exit that and then.
Yeah, I called the word class. Okay, I'll just. Okay. Yeah, anyway, I think anyway, okay, so how about the functions of consciousness? Let's move to the functions. So I've tried to stress in my own work, we've done the neural correlates, these are structural correlates. I've tried to stress in my own work that in addition to looking for structural markers, we should be looking for functional markers of consciousness as well. So yes, I use this analog or FCCs as a way of talking about them to show that they're the sort of functional analog of NCs. So the same methodology should apply. We compare what's happening in a system with consciousness versus a system without consciousness, and we see what functions are different in the system that has consciousness, and we can tease out functions that are at least associated with consciousness. So here's an example from a paper from Fair and Cope from 2014. And what they're doing here, they have a continuous flash detection set up and an apparent motion. So what happens is dots are moving across the screen. And it looks like what they found was we can unconsciously integrate motion information, but only when those elements of motion information are very close together, only over windows of like 100 milliseconds. Anything longer that takes more computation seems to require consciousness. This is one attempt to use the tools that we have to tease out what functions consciousness contributes to a system. So we have NCCs, we have FCCs, and obviously when these things work together, you can get very strong markers of consciousness. So for example, global workspace has both structural and functional elements. And so I think those make for stronger theories about the functions of consciousness. Now, about that little C, Dave, you said correlates, and that's our way of staying metaphysically neutral when we're talking about the neurological foundation of consciousness. I think we can say something a little bit stronger when it comes, at least to functions of consciousness. And I think that's because of another principle at play here, which I've gone to a couple times, and that's causal interventionism. So we're taught by examples across the natural sciences that intervening on or manipulating some target variable can reveal the causal role that it plays in the system that it's part of. And so in cognitive science, we developed a whole slate of ways of manipulating or checking in on manipulations, natural manipulations of consciousness, in order to see or compare between brains that have consciousness versus brains that don't, or tasks where there's consciousness present versus tasks where there isn't. So here you might have some schematic of some psychological process. We have a feature here called distress. This is definitely an experiential element, feeling of distress. And the idea is that we might be able to intervene on that in some way. And in intervening on that variable, we'll understand the causal role it plays in the system that it's in. So these are some of the technical ways that we've come up with for manipulating consciousness. I won't spend too much time on it. We can talk about that in Q&A. But we have masking and suppression techniques, which we've been using for now decades, honing. TMS is now kind of becoming a bit of an old technology. I saw a talk on this TUI, it was transcranial ultrasound. And so they're using ultrasound to go in and try to manipulate different parts of the brain and understand the role that consciousness plays. So the idea here is we're intervening on a variable and seeing what role that plays. If we can do that, I think we can say something a little stronger than mere correlate. This is a contribution, a functional contribution that consciousness is making to the system. So I say functional contribution, I still think that's fairly metaphysically neutral, sort of theory light, in the terminology. But I think the burden of proof starts to have to be on the epiphenomenalist or the dualist, who's going to tell us a story where experience is part of this picture, but it plays no role whatsoever. So I think the burden of proof needs to be shifted. Okay, causal interventionism also suggests a certain notion of function that I favor. So we're intervening on certain variables. On one hand, there are teleological, historical, evolutionary views of function. And on the other hand, there are ahistorical or causal role views of function. I think both are valid research programs, but the evolutionary claims, I just find them hard to make. You're making weird claims over long distances of time. The causal claims are hard to justify. And we often end up with just those stories. So very valuable research program, but I tend to go for a more historical notion of function. What's this variable doing in the system at this moment, regardless of its teleological history? That's something we'll probably get into a lot because there's a lot of different ideas about that. Some people think that the function is gonna have to be an evolutionary function. Maybe my set is a subset of evolutionary functions that might be possible. But I think we can study function in a system without knowing what's happening in its history. And I think again another version of this, I had a quote where Maley and Piccinini say something like, the causal histories that give us these functions are often untold. I mean, they're just such long causal histories, it's hard to kind of come up with a clear story of what that looks like. So claims about the functions of consciousness are rooted in two epistemic or explanatory principles. First, uniqueness. So we want our claims to pick out functions that are unique to consciousness and not something that's common to other psychological constructs, and especially unconscious process. That's our main point of comparison. So our claims about the functions of consciousness should pick out unique features. And again, unique in relation to unconscious process. We also want our claims to be generalized, right? So we make a claim about some function in a system, it's unique to consciousness. We also want it to be generalized. We want our claims generalized to the widest possible range of candidate systems. Otherwise, we might be making trivially narrow claims. So maybe this is a function of consciousness in this grad student, in this trial, in this study. We want to be making claims that generalize good. Now note, it's the unique features that ground generalizability. So it's entirely our ability to find unique features of consciousness that allow us to generalize it to other systems. So, analogy with the dwarf carnation here. I think I'm not buying this, so every time I go into a different domain of science, I just feel like I don't know what I'm talking about, but let's go to botany for a second. So by analogy, the dwarf carnation, it's the unique features of the dwarf carnation that allows us to distinguish it from other flowers in the garden and maybe any other garden in the universe. Now, we might see some common features with other flowers, and that might tell us something like all flowers have stems, something about the larger class that's involved in. But if we want to know about a certain kind of flower, what makes it different from other kinds of flowers, then it's the unique features of the dwarf carnation that allow us to generalize across species. So common features allow us to group the target with other members of a larger class, but say little about how to distinguish our target from other members of the class. And that's really what we want to do. We want to be able to distinguish conscious processing from unconscious processing. So a function of consciousness strives for something like generalizability by way of unique features. So we find unique features and we see how far they generalize across different systems. One way of describing it. In more familiar technical terms, we can use necessary and sufficient as terminology here, not conditions, but to talk about the features themselves, or the markers themselves, as necessary or sufficient. We have a spill here in front of me.
Just get back to me. Sorry,
No problem, no problem.
didn't know we had this vote about it.
There's a lot more going on. All right, so this is another way of saying what I just said. Our claims can be described in terms of necessary and sufficient. Again, talking about the features and their logical relationship to consciousness. So these are used in a lot of different ways. I prefer a sort of function first direction of explanation. So, for example, a function is necessary for consciousness if it's present in every case of conscious experience. That is, it's maximally generalizable. That's just what it means to be necessary. Function is sufficient for consciousness if no unconscious processes are marked by this feature. That is, it's a unique feature, and so its presence is enough to assume the presence of conscious experience. So these two logical relationships give us the sort of degrees of association and dissociation between a candidate marker and consciousness. So a marker that's both necessary and sufficient is going to be highly associated. That would be the gold standard of finding a function of consciousness. But my claim, and something I'm going to argue for a bit later, is that consciousness constitutes too diverse a class for any one theory to pick out its necessary features. So we should expect claims to fail the test of necessity. I'll get back to that later. What we really want is for our claims to be sufficient. We want to know that we picked out something unique. of consciousness. So in other words, we should expect failures of necessity because no one theory, say in terms of neurobiological or psychological underlying properties, can pick up all the instances of consciousness that exist across time and space. Now that's a bet I'm making right now, but I'm gonna flesh it out with some argumentation at the end, but that's what I'm heading towards here. So functions must be sufficient for consciousness, but there's no reason to assume that they're gonna be necessary. And necessary claims can't be verified. So these are claims that can't be verified in the first place. They can be falsified, but we can never verify whether or not something is present in every single case of conscious experience across time and space. So again, functions that are necessary for consciousness but not sufficient, those start to dissociate from consciousness. They don't allow us to distinguish conscious from unconscious processing. So for example, something like recurrent processing in the brain. You might make the claim, recurrent processing, loops of recurrent activity are necessary. That doesn't tell us very much about consciousness until we have if recurrent processing is a feature of a whole bunch of other things in the brain that are unconscious. So without some sort of qualifying conditions, so someone like Lam has given some qualifying conditions, maybe recurrent processing in the inferior temporal lobe at certain frequencies, at certain activation levels, maybe that constitutes a function of consciousness. But as it stands, necessary features are not very informative. They can't help us distinguish between a conscious and unconscious system. And then at the very end, if a feature is neither necessary nor sufficient, we should probably start a new research program or reformulate our marker. That's kind of it. So this is what claims of functions of consciousness amount to. That function X is unique to consciousness and ideally generalizes to a significant range of systems. And B, function X is sufficient and or necessary for consciousness. So that's what we're making. That's what we're saying when we're making claims in the literature about functions of consciousness. Now let's look at some existing ones. Let's see what they're looking. All right. So let's start with the big theories of consciousness. So the most prominent theories of consciousness typically all include claims or entail claims or hypotheses about the functions of consciousness. So global workspace tells us something that consciousness is involved in, the global broadcasting of information, the access by different subsystems, information integration. If you've done any consciousness science, these theories now should be pretty familiar to you. All of them tell us something about a function that they think is related to consciousness. Now, typically these claims are made as necessity claims, that these are necessary for consciousness. But remember, necessity claims imply universality. And so that leaves these claims wide open for criticism, for counterexamples. So that's one way to criticize these theories, show that they're not necessary for consciousness, is to show counterexamples. And we have a lot of them. So Ned's done a lot of work showing counterexamples to global workspace and higher order thought theories. So work like overflow, perceptual overflow, for example, tries to show counterexamples to these major theories, showing that they're not necessary features of consciousness. So these all seem to have counterexamples. That's one big problem. Another big problem, when they're framed like necessity claims, again, they're unverifiable. We can disprove those claims, but we can never positively confirm a necessity claim. You can never know that some feature, information integration, for example, is present in every single instance of consciousness across all time and space. So necessity claims can't be falsified. Never positively confirmed. They can be falsified, they can never be positively confirmed. And necessity claims, as I said, are far less interesting than sufficiency claims anyway. So again, they can tell us about the larger class that the target of inquiry is part of, but doesn't help us say anything about how to distinguish that target from within the class. That's part of it. So in other words, necessity claims typically require much precisification. So we say something like information integration is necessary for consciousness. And then someone shows counterexample, this unconscious integration. That should prompt an information integration theorist to precisify, to qualify the theory. What I mean is integration in certain neural structures at certain activation levels. So these necessity claims, if they are going to be made, they have to be highly qualified. When they're highly qualified, they essentially act as sufficiency claims. So these major theories, I think most people would agree are not necessary, not giving us features that are necessary for consciousness, and that these things have to be present in every single case of conscious experience. Are they sufficient? So are they unique to consciousness? And in that case, could they be used to support a limited range of generalization? So maybe a higher order thought is sufficient, but just in human beings or across primates or something like that. That's an open question, whether these are sufficient or unique to consciousness. I know Ned's talked a lot about building a global workspace in a computer. It could kind of be a nice counterexample to that claim. So, but that's an open hypothesis. That's what we should be looking for here. Is this function truly sufficient for consciousness? That's the interesting thing. Is it unique? So my previous research has kind of brought up, I do domain-specific sort of analysis, try to understand what functions the literature is sort of converging on, both neurobiological and psychological literature. And so in my own work, I found that these are, I think, pretty uncontroversial functions that are only available in humans on trials where they're conscious, where they have conscious experience. So one function of consciousness hypothesis that I made before is that consciousness adds spatiotemporal divisions. And that's something that was just done by hard comparing. Compare trials, how spatiotemporal precise can one be when someone's processing a stimulant conscious versus unconscious. And it looks like you get increased spatiotemporal precision when you're conscious. Also looks like, as I said before, we can integrate things over larger spatiotemporal windows. So talked about that one parent motion example. Consciousness seems to allow us a greater window of integration. Things can be more disparate informationally, and we can still seem to integrate. Consciousness seems to be required. And it seems there's more of a salient semantic richness in conscious vision than there is in unconscious vision. So these are just the beginnings of hypotheses that need to be tested further. But again, I think this domain-specific approach is really helpful. It focuses our hypotheses. And so we have some hypotheses also for the functions of consciousness and emotion. Some strategies for emotional regulation seem to involve consciousness. So things like problem elaboration, certain ways of doing cognitive behavioral therapy. These are all dependent on conscious experience. Flexible behavioral response to emotional stimuli, so not just relying on pre-programmed emotional responses, and having more fine-grained evaluated contents. These are all hypotheses out there for things that consciousness contributes to a system. Sufficient claims, not necessary. These don't have to be in every single case of consciousness across time and space, but I'm making the claim, the hypothesis, these are unique to consciousness, and so can be used as markers, at least within a certain range of generalization. Okay, one more example. I got to use my kid in this. He's habituating right now, or not habituating. So there are informal claims as well. Yeah, that's sure, no problem.
I'll leave with a question.
No problem. So last one, we'll look at the informal claims. So a lot of us have just informal markers or ideas about what consciousness does in a system. And this is a little bit more formal than that, but Ned Block in his book in 2023, although he's interested in describing the distinction between perception and cognition, he makes this claim about habituation at one point, and he just says, habituation, I've never heard of any evidence for decreasing or increasing level of interest as a part of a person's unconscious mental life. I think right here, despite it being informal, he's really picked out what we need to be doing, or the form that modern consciousness research needs to be taking. So, the marker approach. So I think underlying most or all of these different theories or claims are some fundamental explanatory principles that have come to be known as the marker methodology. If you've been following along, it should be pretty easy to understand in the language that I've been using. Don't know why that thing's up there, sorry about that, but basic idea. So basic idea is to look for unique features of consciousness. So these are things that are unique conscious experience that can generalize to a significant range of conscious systems. So at least some significant portion of the population, but ideally you'd want a function that generalizes perhaps to all humans or all primates. That'd be pretty strong claim about the function. I'm wary to look beyond humans. I mean, I think that there is consciousness in all types of systems. But there are just issues with translation, like lots of issues with finding homologies and analogies between biological and even artificial systems. So while I think we should be looking at other systems, I'm kind of a human first, anthropocentric. Let's start with the easy examples, and then we can start doing some translation to other systems. This is not recording. Okay, great.
You said they click on the page again.
Sorry. I'm gonna be left behind. I'm already just technologically behind. My students are just they're like, it's gone. It's gone, yeah. No hope for me.
Wait, it says.
Take it on. All right, so basic idea, look for a unique feature and try to see how much it generalizes. Obviously, making a necessity claim, as I said, we don't need to do that. We don't need to get these things generalized across every single system, but we might find something like multimodal integration that generalizes across quite a broad range of systems. So any system that has multiple, or that does this sort of multiple integration, right? All right, so how do we do this? How do we identify unique features or functions of consciousness, but that are not features of unconscious process? Again, we do this simply by comparing the functional capacities of conscious versus unconscious processing on the same trials. So simple logic, but hard to kind of work out, and we need to precisify our hypothesis. So, habituation, our example. Let's take this as a candidate FCC, functional contribution, functional correlate of consciousness, if you want to remain metaphysical. And let's qualify it. Okay, we're talking about habituation in humans, visual processing in the Western world, and maybe with people without a history of ADHD. So there's all these ways that we can qualify our hypothesis and precisify the scope of the claim that you want to make. But now this is how Ned's quote gets to the heart of the issue. When we have a candidate marker, all we have to do is look for evidence that it doesn't exist in unconscious processes. He says, I've never heard of habituation happening unconsciously. That gives us a very strong candidate marker. So a few, I think, well-designed studies could put kids in, say, a CFS or some sort of masking technique, and we could compare what happens habituation on conscious trials versus unconscious trials, look for evidence of unconscious habituation. Any counterexample would be strong evidence against that as a marker of consciousness, or as a function of consciousness. Okay. We'll move fast here. So objections. So again, problem of subjective report. I'm gonna go quickly over this. I don't think it's as much of a problem that people think. I really think that this is an important foothold into these issues, and again, we bootstrap from very obvious examples. And so adult humans that can speak and tell us that we're conscious is a very good place to start. And same thing with the anthropocentrism. We know our own biology better than other biologies. We have reports, and so I think it's not as big of a problem as people think to start with anthropocentrism. I think it's difficult, and I give props to those who are trying to do that translational work and see if the markers that we find in humans do translate to other animals. But that's not something that I'm going to find that very hard.
But we've been going 41 minutes now. No, it was about 2 minutes of.
And it has some introduction. Okay, let's get to the meat and potatoes.
We haven't had meat and potatoes yet.
No problem. All right, so the marker method, I'll go as fast as I can. So I had a little bit of introduction and we missed the. So I'll try to do the beginning. So the big claim here is how can we do this marker methodology without a general theory of consciousness? This is the big claim I get every time I talk about the marker methodology. How do we do this with we don't have a general theory of what that is? First thing to note is that nothing about comparative methodology seems to imply that we need to have a general theory in place. It happens all across sciences. So for example, in modern astronomy, you might use things like gravitational waves as markers of black holes. And it's funny, I threw this into Google AI, said, is there a general theory of black holes? I said, yes, there's a general theory of black holes, primarily based on a general relativity. Well, it's not a single complete theory encompassing all aspects of black holes. Ding, 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 ding. So not necessary. It's not giving us all the features. We might be picking out some sufficient, unique features. There's no reason to think that those are necessary to every single case of black holes. So they're claims that are just too big and don't need to be made. And for some reason, the major theories of consciousness are always framed in necessity terms. Okay, closer to home, go as fast as I can. Perception as well. This is a construct that's used in so many different ways across so many different labs, so many different empirical programs. Ned Block in his book, trying to give us an account of what perception is, doesn't give us a definition. What do we get? We get a list of markers. And because he's a shrewd philosopher, he says these are probably not going to be the entire list, but these are things that are unique to perception, and they allow us to generalize across certain systems. So maybe if these are vision centric, then we can generalize across visual systems. But the same thing, he proceeds without a general theory of perception in place. There's no such thing as a general theory of perception that is working. Okay, let's wrap it up. So the marker methodology is fundamental, indispensable, common across the sciences. It can proceed without a general theory, without a comprehensive, stable understanding of the target. CCR is contemporary consciousness research, like I want the acronym. And then a shift is needed. This is my big methodological point. A shift is needed away from testing singular claims about necessary, maximally generalizable FCCs to testing a plurality of claims about sufficient or unique FCCs that each support a limited range of generalization. So we shouldn't be working towards a general theory, a single set of features that we think is necessary. This is where pluralism comes in. So it's a widespread assumption that we can't proceed without a general theory. So we have some codes here, I won't read them because I'm running short of time. The consciousness research assumes that we should work towards a general overarching theory of consciousness. I won't go over this in detail. That paper I'm writing now, I asked, what are we looking for in a general theory of consciousness? A winner? Do we think one of these existing theories is going to win out all of a sudden over one of the other ones based on some of these adversarial paradigms? Convergence? there's something kind of confusing about converging theories, answering a hard problem, providing definition. All these paths to a general theory seem fraught with difficulties. I think it's because we're dealing with radical multiple realizability. We're dealing with a construct that by nature is manifest in radically diverse systems, radically diverse kinds of processes. And so I really think the pluralist approach, the one that's sensitive to multiple lower level explanations, that captures multiple features of sufficient features of consciousness, is better than one that tries to make necessity claims based on a fixed set of suspicions. Okay, so is it possible? Does one exist? This is the controversial thing I want to bring up today. Can we have a general theory of consciousness and its functions? There's some metaphysical reasons why I think we can't. So first of all, I think radical multiple realizability prevents a comprehensive theory because the markers derived from different theories dissociate in such radical ways. So that's one metaphysical reason for thinking we're never going to have a theory that covers every case of consciousness and all its functions. There's epistemological reasons. General theories are falsifiable, but they're unverifiable, so they lack epistemic import. And then pragmatic reasons. It may be that instead of trying to prove that there's no such thing as a general theory of consciousness, the burden of proof is on the general theorists to show that there is such a thing and what it looks like. Okay, so I had some final thoughts, but I'll end it there. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks a lot, Bill. That was great.
Technical difficulties, yeah.
Let me start with a question. But yeah, on the move, you moved from functional correlates of consciousness to functional contributions of consciousness. You said, oh, you gave a kind of interventionist argument. We intervene on phenomenal consciousness that will produce these effects. But I wonder if this is vulnerable to basic worry that Ned pointed out back in his PBS article back in 1995, that functions ascribed to phenomenal consciousness can often actually be equally and more plausibly ascribed to access consciousness. So every time we actually intervene on phenomenal consciousness, it seems in most of these cases, one's also intervening on access consciousness. So the result equally suggests, hey, this is we've always got this competing hypothesis potentially in the background that this is a function of access consciousness. But maybe there are fancy things to say to that, like saying they're the same thing or one causes the other. But I wonder how your method ends up.
Yeah, well, I think all the work on overflow is attempt to show counterexamples to these things, to show that you have phenomenal consciousness without access consciousness. I mean, I think that's kind of the points that's maybe not always appreciated in that.
That's in certain special cases, but in a lot of the cases you were talking about, these are going to go together.
Right, they may. So it may be the case that lots of the functions do involve access. I'm okay with that. I think that some of
The other
the
question is, if you're intervening on both access and phenomenal consciousness at the same time in a given experiment, how is this demonstrating a function of phenomenal consciousness
so you have
as opposed to access?
you have to tease those out in an experiment somehow. Yeah, I have to think about that. But yeah, there'd be some way of trying to have one without the other, trying to get the doubly dissociate. I think that's what people are doing. And I think that's where we need to be going, is when we have these kind of markers that we kind of try to negatively test them against them. And yeah, I think that a lot of that work is doing that. I mean, these higher order, these cognitive theories, all this stuff the book was basically about, sort of showing counterexamples to the fact that those things are features of consciousness. So
Okay, let's go to some questions here. Stephanie?
So I guess I sort of have a methodological concern about the marker method. So you suggest that, we should proceed by determining which processes are sufficient for consciousness in conscious organisms, and then drawing generalizations from there. And thinking that when we notice those processes occurring in other entities, that those entities are conscious as well. But then I guess I was thinking, just because something is sufficient for consciousness or for the presence of consciousness in in an organism that generally has the capacity for consciousness, that doesn't mean that it has to be, or that it might be a marker of sufficiency in other entities. So for example, maybe like a certain perceptual process is sufficient for consciousness in the kinds of beings that we are, but if we were to observe it in an organism with lesser cognitive sophistication, it wouldn't be, that, or that process could be done unconsciously.
that's exactly the point. I'm sorry I had to go fast. I tried to do a lot and I talked about it's the anthropocentric origins that I think people worry about and moving to other systems, right? And I think that's a very genuine worry. And I think a lot of work is going to go into translating what we mean by a human marker and translating into different systems. So finding homologies, finding analogies in biological systems, And then in AI systems, really seeing if you have the same sort of functional underlying neural properties, but there's a lot of translation that has to be done, and that's the place where I start to, I throw up my hands, I say, look, we're trying to figure out the easiest case, us, who's saying, and it's hard for us to get markers. We've got to be careful, and that also speaks to the precisification of our hypotheses. So we want to make hypotheses about consciousness in this paradigm, or in this population, or in this species, or something like that. But yeah, I share your worry about having a marker that seems clear as day in human beings, like some of these ones, the way they're articulated, a higher level report. Yeah. But then not being able to find an analogy or homology in a biological system, or understand how the AI system can pull that off. Yeah, I think that those are deep worries, and I'm just sort of like, I'll just stick with the human stuff, and someone out there will do Chris Sanders will do all the translation.
In fact,
Yes, I'm wondering if there's an argument against the visual system being necessary or required for consciousness. Seems like it would
It's-
be.
Yeah, well, certainly not necessary for consciousness to have a visual system. You can imagine a system that doesn't have eyes, but has other organisms, or has other organs of sensory. You can imagine human beings have, damage to the visual system, happens all the time, and so definitely not necessary for consciousness. So that's a good point. I mean, lots of our theories are vision focused. So a visual system, I'd say there's many clear examples that they're not sufficient for, that they're not necessary. So you have someone who's just generally blind and is still conscious in all these other ways, and that's a clear counter example.
I have a question on the marker method and the problem of achieving both completeness and consistency, which is a problem that we have already faced in the axiomatic, for example, for a formulation of arithmetic. So I'm wondering if that impossibility is already baked in.
Maybe, yeah, I don't know, it could be.
And how can we detect it? And maybe we need another method to approach it, or live with it and say we only have an inductive limit. We're gonna live with that, and we're gonna forget
The
about
latter is where I end more of an inductive, the idea is that this is inductive, and our markers are never gonna be fully confirmed as reliable markers. The axioms of IAT is one of the things I'm really against, is this idea that, it's kind of the point, is that we've captured the whole story, but consciousness seems like a very useful psychological property. And so, yeah, I think the epistemological underpinnings are inductive. And so we get markers that are strong, but counterexamples they're powerful. I mean, if you find one counterexample to the candidate marker that really weakens its ability to distinguish conscious from unconscious systems. So yeah, I definitely don't think of things in terms of axiomatic, that's exactly the thing we're not gonna get. I think it's where it's an inductive, ongoing process, just like the process sciences. I didn't get to show you this other slide. But yeah, many examples across the class.
it's much as.
Okay, you said at some point that, well, we don't have evidence against habituation, but, and you said, well, that's good reason for thinking that's a strong marker. But I mean, there's a very big difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. Just because no one bothered looking for unconscious habituation doesn't mean that you can't have unconscious habituation, right? So I agree with you that, if it's really the case that someone looks for evidence of unconscious habituation, and after 10 years of trying very, very hard with our best method, we still can't do it, then that could be good evidence. But just the fact that we don't have evidence, I mean, I don't have evidence for a lot of things just because no one bothered to do it, right? So it doesn't mean anything.
It's true, yeah. This is science progresses, exactly. This is kind of what I'm advocating for. You need to be testing now. You need to be looking for counterexamples to these clear candidate markers. And like you said, the more inductive support we build up for it, the more that we get. But we don't have clear answers. And I think that's one of the lessons here, is that, I think that's kind of how I answer that. So habituation, we need to run a bunch of experiments, and we do need to do that. We do and try. Maybe there's certain kinds of habituation that work unconsciously. And so now we precisify our hypothesis. It's habituation, visual habituation on these trials in humans or something like that. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's these are all sort of launching off points for productive empirical programs, I hope is the idea, yeah.
Yeah, I'll read.
Yeah, I'm also have a question about this marker method approach. Yeah, I wonder if you can give us an example from the psychological sciences. You know, to me, I can't really, tell if the physics example is correct because I'm not in that area, but when you think about something like episodic memory, these are theory driven, right? You have people like Endel Tolving saying the distinction between procedural memory, semantic memory, episodic memory, and so on. And then the markers fall out of that, right?
Yeah.
So we find like different neural correlates, like the hippocampus is important for episodic memory and so on. Maybe the same with attention. Marissa can maybe speak to this better than I can. There's like endogenous and exogenous attention. And then we find we can adjudicate these based on neural markers and so on. And so I'm wondering if you can give an example from the psychological sciences where the markers came first. And because my intuition is that it's not theory free, you always have some kind of theoretical ideas, and then markers come to provide evidence for those.
Yeah, so I never said it's theory free, general theory. Obviously, we're gonna be theorizing about things, but thinking that they're gonna be the general theory. But I think you pointed to something I didn't get a chance to talk about, which is that some of these constructs have experience baked into them. I mean, this is something that you pointed to, so it's an episodic memory. A lot of people think it involves a certain side of kind of consciousness. Ali Boyle has a paper, and so for her, that's a marker of consciousness across creatures. If you can show episodic memory, you can show consciousness in a creature, right? And so there's other examples across psychology. We actually published a paper, me and Mohammed Ali, on ASMR, which is this construct that emerged in online research and then became this thing that really was useful. And it's got experience baked into it. In that construct, ASMR is a certain sensory, emotional tingling. That's the core of the construct. So there's another way we bootstrap ourselves. We find constructs that are kind of involve or necessarily have experience baked into them. So it's not like a chicken and egg situation. That's one very good example where we can have a pretty solid foundation for bootstrapping from there, right? If we have something like that. Like pain's another good example, right? But clearly functional.
Thank you so much for your input. So I wanna ask a very basic question about the conflation of two types of pluralism. One is just capital pluralism with E, and the other one is more thinking about anti-general.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said on the first one.
Yeah.
I'm deaf, so.
No, so my question is specifically about conflicting two types of pluralism.
Okay.
One is thinking about it more in a broader sense, and the other one is more in terms of anti-general theory sense. And
Yeah.
I think maybe the reason why I want to focus on that is I think maybe there's something to the pushback. So if we truly want to be a pluralist, why can't we just say this type of methodology of focusing on general theory is just one way of looking at things across other things, rather than just going through rejecting that to be a pluralist. And I think if we say, as a result of that, we could say, well, in some theories, we have that like top to bottom approach, in some of them, bottom to top, and in some other, we are having that wide directionality. And I think if we go along with that, then we would have a different sense of what those necessity claims are about. We could make sense of them through conceptual analysis or thinking about it in terms of modal claim, rather than thinking that they are necessarily thinking about instances that would fit into certain types of markers.
Right, okay, yeah, lot you said there. I guess one thing I would say is that the reason to argue against wasn't just to reject it as one other way, as the general theory, it's that it restricts consciousness research. So what happens is, trying to find the slide here. Yeah, that's the one. So a general theory approach necessarily restricts consciousness research to a single explanation of a single marker derived from a single system, often anthropocentric, right? Whereas pluralistic, so basically what one of the arguments is that a general theory restricts the field. It really restricts where we're looking for consciousness, right? So if we all bought higher order thought theory right now, we'd be looking for it only in human beings and beings with prefrontal cortex. We'd be leaving it out. So you would say no. So maybe I'd love to hear that's not the case, but just as an example, right? Yeah, so the idea is that it restricts consciousness research to looking at one or a couple of its underlying properties as opposed to this rich research program where we follow a whole bunch of different markers, sufficient markers of consciousness. Some derived from emotional consciousness, some derived from vision, some derived from audition. So the big argument is that it's restrictive of the field.
Okay, David Rosenthal.
I wasn't gonna say anything, but,
Hey,
on this war between markers and theories, one of the things that, theories might be good for is fixing the reference of the term. And you said very much at the beginning, look, we all know what it is. And you also said, which I didn't believe, that there are lots of cases in science where, or at least there are some other cases in science, where everybody knows what it is, but nobody can really give a good theory about that. It does seem to me that I wish you hadn't done that, because I wanted to talk about the slide that
oh,
you were on, but
yeah, well, here's some
it was pluralism on the left, on the right, who restricted stuff on the left. And what I wanted to say was, that's fine. Kristen Andrews has this idea that, look, all animals are conscious. It's just that they're conscious in different ways. And I have the feeling, well, conscious in different ways, but who knows whether we're still talking about the property that we were originally talking about. And the good thing about a theory is that it can avoid that worry. And the bad thing about a pluralistic approach is, well, it's a lot of fun because, it opens it up for squids and robots and financial systems and so forth and so on. But who knows whether we're talking about consciousness still?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, that's the point, is I kind of said earlier on that project is different, fixing the reference and describing that thing and defining it, and all our talk about what its likeness is different than our account than this sort of theorizing what its underlying neural and psychological properties. Right? So I agree with you, the theory is playing a role in fixing the reference. But I just think that yeah, I guess.
So if you've got theories that are applying to different systems that are fixing the reference in different ways, my question is, how do you know that you're talking about the same phenomenon?
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is that's an ongoing project, just like the project of.
That doesn't seem to be a good answer.
Okay,
I mean, if we're talking about robots or, amnesia or something like that, we want to know whether we're talking about the same phenomenon.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, again, fixing the construct is a hard thing, getting a clear, and a theory might help us precisify the construct. A theory also does something like try to explain the underlying neural and those are just different projects.
Well, some
Okay, last round, then Joanne, we're done. No, go ahead, one more. Okay, then I guess that's all we have time for, so thank you very much, everyone.